Well, I figured I'd really spice up our Saturday night with some good real estate data. I know I've gotten on a couple other tangents lately, but I figured we've got some good data to be talking about, and I wanted to share. Uh, as I've talked over the weeks, there's different ways that we can really try and understand and track what's happening out there. We can compare year over year, and that gives us a really good idea of how this particular market is performing towards a more stable market. But when we do that, we can look at a variety of different things. We can look at the number of homes coming on the market. We can look at the number of homes going under contract. We've talked a little bit more about seeing the ones that are going into a temp status where they're not allowing showings. We've talked about price changes, though price changes we typically don't look year over year as much. We look previous weeks pre-COVID, so to say. So those all tell us different things of what we're seeing out there and how it's happening. From a pricing perspective, we're still not in this really enough to understand if we're seeing closed properties having them close at lower price points. I'm guessing we're going to start to see that in the coming weeks. But we're about 5 weeks into this, a little shy of this, and so there are a couple, but most of what we're closing out right now is still pre-COVID, so to say. So we're not really seeing too much of a price impact. The data that I wanted to share tonight, a little bit of a different perspective, a little bit more maybe forward thinking. I spent a good amount of time today diving into what some of our real estate activity looks like throughout this. More from tracking it in terms of number of showings as well as online activity. I mean, it's interesting because they're both showing a little bit of the same thing, which is why I thought it'd be a good thing to talk about them kind of side by side together. Now, realistically, when we saw in Illinois the stay-at-home order put into place, right away we saw a sharp decline in everything. Number of homes coming on the market, number of homes going under contract, number of showings, online traffic, everything got very quiet. It's what I kind of have looked back on now and said it was a little bit of a paralysis time. I think a lot of shock factor. Now, the interesting thing to note about the online activity, it saw a sharp decline just like everything else, but not nearly as severe as showings, properties coming on, contracts, all of that, which I think when you actually think about it, not too surprising. People were still stuck on their phones, stuck in their houses, and still spending a lot of time on Zillow, Trulia, those sites. And what we tended to see is we saw it about half. The online traffic was about, as I kind of say, it outperformed the decline by about 50%. So if everything was down, year over year, about 40, 50%, online traffic was down 20, 25%. Interestingly enough, we saw most of that kind of peak in its decline. I probably shouldn't call it peak. I'm being a terrible economist, which I'm not an economist. But if I were, that would be a terrible thing to say. But it bottomed out right around the time that the initial stay-at-home order went into place. So showings and showing traffic and online exposure, those things all that in the very, very beginning, there was and it hit hard. Since then, those two things have both been growing and seeing some decent growth to get back to a relatively stable point, or a more stable point, I should say. And interestingly, the longer we've been in this, the more growth they've seen. What I find is the most interesting point was that when we saw, and most of that was fairly steady between when the stay-at-home order went into place and the original end date of the stay-at-home order, which I believe it was April 7th. Between that time, we saw, I wouldn't say huge growth, but we saw some steady, stable, sometimes I call it a toddler roller coaster. We saw that type of growth in terms of the number of showings as well as the online activity. Interestingly enough, though, the most severe growth that we've seen is pretty much from that first week in April. So between about April 7th to April 10th, depending on which data you're going to rely on the most, between that and now. So in the last 2+ weeks, both of those sectors, online activity and number of showings, has shown pretty aggressive growth. And in fact, right now, online activity is outperforming the online activity from 2019. once again, doesn't surprise me tremendously in the sense that people are stuck at home, have a little bit more time, are spending more time on their computers, on their phones, everything like that. But I think that it's important to note that when you have that type of increase and you've got a pretty severe increase in the number of showings, that is showing us that there is some good movement in the real estate market, in the residential real estate markets in Chicago. Part of it is I think we are getting more comfortable with it. Part of it is I think we're getting better at it. I think sellers are starting to feel a little bit better now about the fact that we've really gotten the protocol to a good point. And as we've talked about it before, there are people that don't have the luxury of the ability to wait. I mean, most of my clients that have the ability to wait, unless they really have something specific that we're trying to do, I'm trying to do as much without getting them into properties. But as we've talked about, there are people that have to do something sooner than later, and they don't have that luxury. And I think it's good to see that they are out there. We're seeing that loosen up, and the real importance to me in that, there are many economists out there right now that really feel like real estate is going to be part of what helps us, kind of leads us out of this nobody knows what to even call it, this type of economy, because it's so drastic and sudden. But there's a lot of confidence in the real estate market kind of being one of the leaders out. Now, we've got to still get through a lot of stuff before we get there, but I just wanted to report that we are seeing some positives. We are seeing some growth in the activity, which I think is good. Let's consider that a win for right now. So on that note, be kind to one another, be kind to yourself, take care of one another, take care of yourself, be responsible in your social distancing, absolutely be love cats. Give shout outs for all of our essential workers, regardless of what they're doing. They are all working incredibly hard to keep us moving in the right direction. I am thrilled to be through another day with you. I am looking forward to getting through all of this with you. And I, as promised, will see you tomorrow night.